Very much. I guess I won't have to use my own phone for the timekeeping. I'm going to stand up here because we're going to do things a little bit differently. And so I want to just say first, thank you to all of you who have decided to stick it out for this last panel of the day. I was afraid we were going to be speaking to a group of 10. At least this is a little bit better. So because of that, we're going to reward you because I know that there's been a lot of great content, but you know, I know that time gets away, questions don't get to be asked as much as many of you will hopefully have. So we wanted to do something a little bit different. So first off, I have a great panel here, and I'm going to just briefly just introduce them by the name, but they are going to also speak a little bit about themselves in the context of what I've done is I've asked them to talk about why are they in this work. Because we have some really great people with lots of experience. And then what we want to do is we want to open up the floor to all of you, and we want to engage you in this conversation with us, particularly around forging ahead. And I'm saying this now because I'm giving you a heads up for those of you who need to be thinking about what you might want to say. We're going to ask you to just tell us in one word, all right, what it is that you want us to be talking about as it pertains to this topic about forging ahead, all right? I want you to use just one word, because then that way we could get in as many, words as possible. Even if it's just popcorn style, you could be yelling it out, whichever is fine. You know what, why don't you start saying that now, and then we'll start afterwards, have them introduce themselves after you all talk. So let me just hear from all of you. What do you all want to hear?
Best practices.
Best practices. Unity. Profanity. All right. You know what? I've been telling people, I've been saying, you know what? Because you all stayed around, we are going to be the most controversial, the most profane. We are going to be the most like unplugged panel that you will have stayed for, and you'll be glad that you did that. They all don't know that yet. I'm just saying that now. They didn't know that. But I'm just saying it now because otherwise, what's the fun? You could help along too, though. All right, what else do we have?
Equity.
Equity?
Youth.
Okay, I heard equity, youth, talent?
Next steps.
Action. Impact. How do you plug the leak? Okay.
Civic engagement.
Civic engagement.
Real power.
Real power. Opposed to fake power, right? All right. What else? I'm sorry? Collaboration. Accountability. Did I hear growth? Growth, okay. Anything? Responsibility. Success stories, okay. Creatives? Failures, sorry, okay. Failures.
And embarrassing moments.
Okay, yeah, we're gonna lay it all out here. So, okay. What else? Anything else? Fortitude, ooh. Grit, right?
Stakeholder buy-in.
Oh, stakeholder buy-in. Wow, are you getting all this? I have, we have quite a bit of good themes here. All right, I'm going to stop here because then they're going to be like, oh my God, where do I start? Okay, thank you to all of you for sharing this because this at least gives all of the panelists kind of a sense of what you're interested in hearing about. So I think we're going to be talking definitely about, a number of these things, but this is very helpful. So let me just do this. I'm just going to call them each out by name, and I'm just going to then ask them to just give their why. Why are they in this work? So first off, we have to my immediate left, I have Patsy Doerr, who is the Global Head of Corporate Responsibility and Inclusion for Thomson Reuters. So Patsy, what's your why?
Absolutely. So first of all, it's always great to be the last panel. So we are going to, I've used my, that's better. It's always great to be the last panel, so we're going to keep our energy up really live and particularly include profanity and controversy in our discussions. So yes, for me, the why is multifaceted. So first of all, it comes on the aspect of individuals, our roles and responsibilities as individuals in our communities, with our purchasing power, with our voices, and also within our organizations. Secondly, from a business perspective, and I'm thinking about Thomson Reuters, but all of our partners and clients as well, the business case and the need for diversity. I mean, we're very focused on what's the impact on engagement, innovation, productivity, and the bottom line. And there's some real statistics out there that we can discuss during today's panel as well, as I think many of you know. And the third piece is really, and it was mentioned earlier in the last panel, the power of the collective, which is the public-private partnerships coming together to really work on these issues in a collective way. Because at the end of the day, why I care about that piece is because I care about building a sustainable business development opportunity for the world, frankly, and utilizing the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework, which include a huge focus on diversity and inclusion. So I'll stop there.
All right, great. Okay, right next to her is Pamela Lipp-Hendricks, and she's the head of talent management and diversity for our host, JPMorgan Chase. Looks like you have a fan base here, right?
That's good, the home team advantage. So for me, if you think about financial services, really what we have, it's all about our talent. For us to really make a difference, whether it's the bottom line, whether it's in our communities, we have a big corporate responsibility effort. It's all about the talent. And if we don't have the best talent with the best ideas, and that's only done through diversity, then we lose before we've ever started. And so they're really intertwined, and that's what's going to help us win and stay ahead.
Great. And then right next to her is Jyoti Chopra. She is the Chief Diversity Officer, Managing Director, and Head of Global Citizenship and Sustainability for BNY Mellon.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here, and thank you to our hosts and also to John. I really just want to take a quick minute to commend you for putting this convening together. It's been absolutely phenomenal. So the why for me is twofold. Firstly, the industry that I'm in, banking and financial services, has not really moved the needle in the last several years. And so it's about carrying the mantle, being the conscience and the voice of the company, advocating for change, role modeling, and really being the torchbearer to effect change. For me, it's about trailblazing. It's about creating pathways for others. Every person I help promote, recruit, develop, to me, that's a milestone. And on a personal level, I'm the child of immigrants. I was first generation into this country. Arrived here at the age of 18, worked full-time, put myself through school, both undergraduate, and I just recently went back and actually finished business school as a mid-career professional, fulfilling a long ambition of mine. And I feel a tremendous sense of responsibility to pay it forward. And I think that this is one of the best areas to do that and to be a culture carrier.
All right, great. All right, last but not least, we have Michael Garner, who's president of 100 Black Men of New York. I have to say, Michael, before you showed up, we thought it was just going to be a conversation with the three of us women here, and we thought, well, we could do without a guy here. We're just going to have a great conversation. But we're glad that you're here. So thank you. So why are you in this work? What's your why?
Well, I'm here. I'm president of the founding chapter of the 100 Black Men. We were founded in 1963 by Mayor David Dinkins, Congressman Charlie Rango, baseball great Jackie Robinson, as being the solution to issues that blacks go through in this great city. In my day career, I'm vice president and CDO at the MTA. Small agency, we move about 8.5 billion people a day. We also spend about $15 billion a year, and it's great being in the inside in which you can have a influence on how those dollars are being spent. And so why, if in fact that you're buying goods and services from companies whose workforce does not reflect their market, don't buy your goods and products from them. And so it is my dual roles is to make sure that taxpayers' monies are spent in an inclusive manner. That's why I'm here, to drive efficient and effective change.
Okay, all right. So let me just start with this question based a little bit on what you just said, Michael, but also a little bit about what the last panel talked about a little bit. I think a lot of us would agree that it's the responsibility, or at least that's the way I see it right now, is it's the responsibility of the companies, because it's your company, to drive diversity and inclusion internally. However, I'll just lay it out there, whether you agree or disagree. I'll say that internal stakeholders, I think, there are blind spots and limitations, and so for various reasons. So I'm going to direct this question to both Patsy and Michael. I'm going to say, whose responsibility is it to ensure that new majority talent and assets are recognized, utilized, or integrated so that it's normal, right? We have this theme here that says it's the new normal. Is it external organizations like 100 Black Men, or is it marketplaces as reflected by the Thomson Reuters Diversity and Inclusion Index? And so just a little bit of a different way to kind of start this. So Michael or Patsy, which one of you wants to start? Okay.
We're both happy to start. I'll take the microphone for right now. No, it's a great question. I think in my view, it really is both, right? So you really have the corporations, as I mentioned earlier, who have a strong business case to actually build diversity into their culture, right? If we think about, as I mentioned, the impact on the bottom line, but also on the talent being a key piece of that. And secondly, the customers. Our customers care about this work. They care more and more about it. As a factoid, or a fact, I should say, we're seeing in RFPs an 84% increase in people asking questions about diversity and inclusion and sustainability and civic engagement. So this is a real need and an expectation. And then finally, and this gets back to the index, Linda, the investor community. So it's been fascinating, as many in this room are very well aware of, how much the rise of impact investing has been over the past couple years. We're looking at a $22.9 trillion industry right now. And so we need to be providing, as companies, the data to help those investors make decisions in companies that are doing better or worse in these areas and help them get better. So very specifically, our index, and I'll talk about it in more detail as we move forward, but my role is both internal and external facing. So internal in terms of developing those programs internally to drive these goals, but also externally looking at our environmental, social, governance data and making sure that we're packaging in a way that is meaningful for companies to gauge their own success and for investors to make those right decisions. So I think the answer is it's the power of the collective again, and it's public and private partnerships.
Okay, Patsy, I'm gonna follow up a little bit. Right? So, are businesses like the index, or Thomson Reuters through the index, able to hold companies accountable based on that index?
Absolutely. So just to give you all a brief macro view of what our index is, because we're referring to, I think many people might be aware of it, but if you're not, so we launched about 1.5 years ago a diversity and inclusion index that we pulled from our database. So we have an ESG database that tracks these issues, 400 metrics across 6,500 companies, industry agnostic. And we narrowed down a set of 27 variables that define an effective, diverse, and inclusive environment. And you wouldn't be surprised by what those variables are, ranging from diverse representation to inclusive culture and to news and controversies, interestingly enough, because many companies can be talking the talk, but they're not necessarily walking the walk, if you will. And so how can we hold companies accountable? In our purview, and this is one of our indices, but a very important one for us, is that once a year we launch the top 100 companies. And so this is an opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, for companies to understand how well they're doing in this space and where they can actually work to improve their scores. It gives us an opportunity to engage with our clients. So again, the role of the corporation in terms of holding other companies accountable is say, if you want to be in this top 100, we want it to be aspirational, we want it to be real, and we want it to be based on publicly available data that is entirely objective, right? So we're trying to build that model into the messaging. And then secondly, getting back to investors without belaboring the point, but at the end of the day, this index is a very important tool for the investor community. And so we talk about accountability. Investors who are growing in this space, who have to actually look at the trends follow the money, right? So we know that in the next 3 to 5 years, 70% of assets under management will be in the hands of the new majority. We're looking at $67 trillion US. So that is a real figure, a real focus area that we need to take a look at. So getting back to accountability through the index and through other measures, we're giving people and those investors, analysts, and ultimately the consumer the opportunity to make decisions on where they put their money based on this index, which is basically about accountability.
Okay, that's great. So, you know, I want to follow up on that with Michael. A question for you. And maybe you could talk about the first question about, you know, whose responsibility is it? And then I have another question for you right after that based on what she said.
Great. So it's both. Effective leadership starts at the top. The chairman and CEO of the board, they hire talent in order to change the paradigm of who's being hired and who's winning contracts. So it's both. And then there's groups like the 100 Black Men who will hold those companies and those agencies accountable. And let's talk about, historically speaking, let's talk about at the forefront of effective change is government. The largest employer of blacks in this nation is government, because the private sector has never hired blacks the way that they should have hired blacks. And so as we see what's happening down in Washington right now, whereas there's a effort to turn the hands back of gains that we have made in this country since 1619. We talk about Tim Marshall, immigrants. I'm probably 14th generation immigrant here in this country. And so we need to make sure, in the words of Bob Marley, we got to fight for our rights. And we cannot allow anybody to turn the hands of time back in this country that we helped build. I mean, even John, if you look in this great city that we live in, the most diverse city in the world, the Fortune 500 capital of the world, where there's billions of dollars of transactions taking place every day. And if you go to the South Bronx is the third poorest county in the country, right? Billions of dollars being spent, but yet the South Bronx is the third poorest county in the country. And so effective change historically in this country have in fact been driven by government. And so it's both.
Okay. And then, so can you talk about some examples of how, like, advocacy organizations like the 100 Black Men, what have, I mean, you know, obviously, you know, partnerships with government, but also what about other partnerships with other entities, like whether it's higher education institutions or corporations, small business? Can you give some examples of solutions that have brought together new majority partners to actually even just move the needle, create some type of change? Do you have anything that you could share with us?
Yeah, this conference right here, John and his visionary leadership. The conference was in Las Vegas next year, so I'm optimistic it's going to be somewhere else next year, and I'll be there. But the vision is to drive effective change with other groups. And basically, once again, I said that if the private sector is not hiring that's going to mimic their workforce or their market, if they're not buying their goods and services from a diverse pool of vendors and suppliers, don't buy your goods from them. Boycott them. And then sooner or later, they will get the message, because the CEO is going to focus on bottom line results, profit. And so if you hurt someone's profit, then they're going to bring in change. And so the immediate next step here is that there needs to be follow-up meetings, and we need to organize strategies of how we're going to drive effective change with respect to workforce and vendors and suppliers.
Okay, all right, great. That's food for thought, John. And to the rest of the partners of the new majority as well, too. I know that there's conversations definitely going on as well, too. So definitely, I think, something to do, because what I'm hearing is that it definitely does take both the internal and external forces being able to just keep the pushing, keeping the change going. Okay, so I want to ask a little bit in terms of going back to the internal champions. You know, the idea that the new majority, again, is the new normal for business. So, you know, I think perhaps this might be something that we're all a little, maybe a tiny bit biased, because this is the work that we all do, or at least this is something that we're very much interested in. But, you know, we know from just what has happened over the last, I'll say, year or so, that we know that not everybody agrees with this idea that there is a new majority and that it's the new normal, and in fact that there's forces at work that would like to try to roll that back. I'm going to ask this question of Jyoti and Pamela. So I want to just ask you, what are the roadblocks that you face within your companies to recognizing and valuing the new majority assets and talent that exist within your companies?
So I'm happy to start. I would say in terms of roadblocks, I think it was probably limitations around education and awareness around how to recruit, for example, from different sources. It's not that there was ill intention or a desire not to recruit. I think it was more people didn't know how to. So I'm going to use recruiting as a live example. In the last 4 years, we've taken our diversity recruiting from the low 30s to almost 40% in the US on an annualized basis. That didn't just happen. It took a concerted effort and change management and interventions, right? You have to change how you're doing things. You've got to sort of almost take a diagnostic approach to it. You know, what isn't working, why, and then sort of try and pilot and innovate new things. So we did a couple of things. The first was we formed public-private partnerships to expand our sources of prospective talent in the marketplace. The second was we designed our own recruiting forums, our own recruiting events, and we actually had our chairman, CEO, and members of our executive committee host these. We started in the biggest markets, and then we've significantly expanded these internationally. But this was about letting talent, prospective talent, get to know our company, our leaders, and our people, and opening the doors and letting them come into our offices, come into our organization and get to know us. And that did two things. It helped us build a prospective talent pipeline, databases of resumes, et cetera. And the second thing is we began recruiting through this, and then we began to focus on very specific levels. And touching on sort of this question about stakeholder buy-in, we've been very targeted and focused in these recruiting efforts. So for example, we decided to do a forum on technology. So we really got very micro about which jobs in technology did we have the most open recs for, who were the hiring managers, who were the recruiters, got them involved in the programs and in the events, got their early adoption and buy-in, and made them part of that whole process. And that's what I think has fueled the change. And then the last piece is, as you begin to recruit people from programs like this, internally we formed a cohort. So we now have the recruits from our programs engaged, coming together on a regular basis, helping us expand into their networks and into their territories. And that's proved very fruitful. The last piece I just want to share is a leading best practice. After doing this for about 18 months, we said, okay, we've figured out a mechanism to increase recruiting on the outside. Let's now take that model and begin to focus on our own internal talent development. And so we mirrored that program and began to host events and forums for our own high potential diverse talent, giving them exposure to senior management and our chairman CEO. And so those are a couple of things that we've done that have been pretty significant for us in really accelerating a change in our numbers.
That sounds great. Pamela, what's happening with you at JPMorgan Chase in terms of roadblocks, and what's some best examples that you have of how you've managed to get around those?
A couple of things. I'd say similar. I would have just said managers, right? Managers are the key, right? Because they're the day-to-day. They're responsible for setting the environment. They're responsible for the hiring and development and promotion. And so in a complex organization, how do you get to them? So I'd say one of the first things we did was we have a dedicated communications person that helps us think through how do we do all of our diversity communications. So that's across the new majority, that's across our disability space, LGBT, so across everything. How do we think about how we're communicating, and how do we want to hold managers accountable to make sure that they have the right information? I'd say similar to what Jyoti said, we started in 2016 two key initiatives. One, Advancing Black Leaders. Val Rainford's in the back of the room who leads that. And that's really with a laser focus on the hiring, retention, advancement, and promotion of blacks. And so that is targeted sourcing, because to Jyoti's point, right, I think that's the first thing managers say is, well, there is no talent. And I would say that's the first thing you do to prove the managers wrong is you present them with talent. And then that's been Val's big strategy and big win, which has really helped us to move our numbers. And the same thing in the disability space, which is we're now starting with educating managers in the disability space to say, here's how you interact with people with disabilities if they're visible. Because a lot of times when we present a candidate slate and a candidate comes in and there's a visible disability, managers don't know what to do. They freeze. They're like, how do I shake someone's hand? Or, what do I do? And so we're doing a lot of educating just across the board to be able to get managers comfortable with as broad and diverse slate as we can have.
Sounds like we've got some interesting things going on. So I'm going to take a pause here because we've now had a chance to hear from each of the panelists, and I just want to be conscious of time. I want to ask, does anybody have any questions? We still got a lot of time, but I still want to ask questions midstream right now because I know stuff comes up. I see someone's hand way back there in the corner.
Oh, is it on?
Yes, it is.
My question is for Patsy. I'm Bill Kapfer. I run supplier diversity for JPMorgan Chase. Thank you all for being here. I'm curious about, we talked about diversity in the workplace, but for Reuters, how are you focusing on diversity in the marketplace and supplier diversity?
No, it's a great question, and nice to meet you, and thank you for hosting us as well. Sorry. At a macro level, which is not as related to your question, but let me just start here, because I want to build off the points that were raised on the panel so far. One of our approaches, which has been very deliberate, is to ensure that we have the right balance between diversity and inclusion. Because you can bring in all this great diverse talent, but if the culture doesn't support it, it's not going to work. And so really trying to find that balance between the representation aspect and education and accountability to develop a culture that supports diversity of all aspects, not only representative groups, but also thought, style, experience, and approach. As part of that, we've been very deliberate as well to look at the entire employee life cycle. I am getting to your question. From recruitment to development to engagement, retention, and the whole sort of, you look at the whole gamut, you must look at it consistently across all aspects. You cannot over-focus on one part versus another. It has to be a constant focus at multiple touch points. From a supplier diversity perspective, we have started very recently, frankly, in the past year and a half. In fact, we have a new person that just joined us about a year ago to really look at that. We're looking at our supply chain, to answer your question specifically now, amongst many different levels. So not only diversity, but also around sustainability, also around human trafficking, and things of that nature, working with our foundation. So we have a model in place now that's being built out as we speak. It has components around education, educating our sourcing managers, educating our partners and our suppliers, and also, again, then holding them accountable and making sure that as we go through this process of vetting suppliers, that they're meeting the criteria that we need and want to have working with our organization. Does that make sense?
Please feel free to use us as a resource, too, as you continue to build out your program.
Excellent. That's wonderful. Thank you. We will do that.
Patsy, can I just ask you a real quick question, just based on what you just said? So, based on your index, is Thomson Reuters walking the talk? Are you following the kind of things that you're, I guess, basically, holding others accountable for? And
yeah. Absolutely, and of course I have to say yes, right?
Of course you do,
but Reuters, we're doing a phenomenal job. But we actually are doing a very good job, thanks to the fact that we do have real buy-in from the top. I mean, our CEO, Jim Smith, who became the CEO 6 years ago, when he first took on the position, at the same time that I joined the organization, basically he said, which is why I joined the organization, by the way, he said that part of what he wanted to achieve with the business over the coming years was to really focus on diversity and inclusion because he believed that it was important as an individual, but also to the bottom line. I mean, he really saw the business case. And so I keep bringing that up again and again, but that's really how we've tried to avoid or to move past roadblocks. It's always going back to the business case. So to your specific question, we're number 57 on the index right now.
Okay.
Out of 6,500 companies, that's not bad. Clearly want to be number one, or at least in the top 10. Thank you.
Okay.
But it is, and so the reality is that yes, and if the index was not objective, we'd be number one. So hey, we're working off our data.
All right.
So we're doing well.
Okay.
But one of the things I'll just add to that, which builds off your question, is that I mentioned it briefly earlier. one of the key pillars amongst our 27 variables that actually sits above 3 or 4 is this whole concept of news and controversies. And so we track very specifically, not only for ourselves, but all the other companies who are part of the index, are there any outstanding lawsuits? Are there any sort of media controversies around these issues? So again, are we actually walking the talk? So that's really baked into the system, Linda.
Okay, that's good to know. So I do want to just also say, though, that I'm sure that we have a lot of representatives of a lot of different organizations here who are probably going to be watching that index with great interest and also holding all of you accountable as well, too. So I'm just saying. We have another question here. Okay. So okay, we got 2 questions. So I do want to say, if you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, I am just going to keep moving. But we have a question.
Hi, Valerie Rainford, JP Morgan. So Patsy, just curious, how much of moving the needle and representation is factored into the index?
Sure. Great. And by the way, after today's session, if it would be helpful, I can also distribute a tear sheet on the index, which provides more information around the specific variables, if people would be interested. So we'll do that. Perfect. So it is actually about 25%, Valerie, of the index if I look across the 27 variables. So we're looking at about 4 or 5 variables that are focused on representation. And we're looking, one of the things, and now I'm going to do a sell for Thomson Reuters again. One of the things that distinguishes our index is that we look at diversity across all aspects of it as part of the index. It's not gender specific, it's not race specific, it really looks across the entire board of diversity. And so representation, both from the recruitment perspective and the retention piece, and all the elements mentioned earlier, are also baked into the system.
So can I do a follow-up question? Sorry.
That's okay.
So would you all consider, sorry to put you on the spot.
No, not at all. I'm happy to be put on the spot.
Would you all consider doing a measure on representation and moving the needle for the new majority?
100%. I mean, I think we're halfway there, but Valerie, absolutely. It's, this is an evolving process. It's the second iteration of the index, and any way that we can add more value to the community here and more broadly, we will do that. So thank you.
All right, John, something to keep an eye out on. Okay, we have another question over here.
Chengzhu with the Minority Business Development Agency, Manhattan Business Center. We help a lot of minority-owned businesses gain greater access to contracts and capital. And one of the major frustrations we've been hearing from minority-owned businesses is that they can't become the prime contractors for major corporations. A lot of them are high-performing companies, selling quality products and providing quality services, but so far they're just staying as subcontractors to non-minority firms. And so what would be your advice to help those companies move their status from being a subcontractor to a prime contractor so they own the relationship with major corporations?
Let's have Michael take that, yeah.
So the owners like the MTA, for example, we started this journey about 9 years ago. We were ranked 88th in the state with dollars paid to certify minority companies. We're now ranked number 1. And we got to number 1 because we went on a listening tour and we came up with solutions to issues that those firms face. So for example, when you start to debundle your projects into smaller packages and then going out and then recruiting those certified firms to bid on your product or your service as a prime contractor, it's better working as a prime contractor than a sub because now you are in fact in control of your own destiny. You're not being, you're being paid in 30 days as opposed to 6 months. And so we understand that in order for us to be more inclusive, we need to change the way that we do business. And now we are debundling large projects into smaller projects. We're paying our contractors in 10 days. We're waiving bonding. And so we're doing the things, and we're ranked, once again, out of 96 agencies and authorities, we're ranked number 1 in the state right now.
Okay, so we're wide-ranging here. So I'm going to, actually, we have another question? Okay.
Hello, hi. My name is Aradhana Hines from Cora Group, and I just had a question with regard to hiring, retention, and promotion. Oftentimes, you'll find that leadership really supports the idea of diversity and inclusion. It has great programs. However, when you get to middle management, the mood is very different, where there might be the HR officer that looks over their resume with the foreign-sounding name, or department heads that just really play favorites very obviously. Do you have any suggestions or tips of how that can be managed in terms of creating a more inclusive organization?
Do you want to direct it to someone specific? Otherwise, maybe it looks like Jyoti and
Whoever
maybe
has
Pamela?
any suggestions.
Okay.
Yep, sure. So I'd say a couple of things. You need to create mechanisms within the organization to elevate the profile and create visibility for your talent. And you can do that a few ways. The development of or instituting talent profiles, doing a spotlight on role models, showcasing talent, etc. There's formal and informal ways. We've actually created events and programs where we tap our high potential diverse talent, and we actually create events where we get them physically in a room to give them exposure to senior management and executive management. The second thing we've done as part of our talent development processes is instituted a much more rigorous talent review and development effort, where we actually go through and review talent and create lists of our top diverse talent. They are reviewed and discussed in talent roundtables, where development plans are actually discussed and sort of 2-year, 3-year, 5-year sort of roadmaps are put together. So those are a few mechanisms that we've instituted at BNY Mellon.
And I would flip it a little bit too. So I think those are really good mechanisms, and the talent reviews are really important. And a lot of companies are moving to kind of take, when it's the resume, to take some of the identifying information off. So that's a best practice that a lot of companies are shifting to. I think the other side of that is for talent to be ready when they're called. And so I spend a lot of time coaching people, or we all spend a lot of time coaching people. I find that when talent at that level is often called, they're not crisp on their experiences and the impact. They're very clear on what's on their resume, and they present themselves and say, here's all of the things I've done. But that doesn't tell me what you've learned, the impact you have, and why I want to hire you, especially if you're making you're making some kind of career change. So I always tell people to be ready with your story, your 30-second story, your 2-minute story, and your 5-minute story. Practice it into your smartphone, videotape yourself, and then be ready so that when you're called, because we're all moving the mechanisms to try to think about diversity, to put more diverse candidates in front of managers, to require those diverse slates. But you've got to be ready when you're called.
So, you know, it's amazing how when you tie compensation into results. So, for example, as opposed to hearing about, I can't find diverse talent. But if I was the new football or basketball coach at Notre Dame, and if I didn't win, what happens?
You're fired.
I'm fired. So if you have managers who say that in the most diverse city in the world, that I cannot find diverse talent, and if their compensation was tied to the success of them reaching out and bringing in qualified talent, they should not be, their bonus should not be what it should be, because they did not fully execute their job duties and responsibilities, right?
I mean, ideally, right? But that's kind of like Congress deciding whether or not they're going to continue to take pay if they can't pass a budget.
And in 1947, when Jackie Robinson first was signed by the Dodgers, did that mean that Jackie Robinson couldn't play before 1947? No. You know, he had talents and skills, because they would not let blacks to Major League Baseball. He was banned from playing for any team in the league. So he was as talented prior to 1947 as he was after 1947, right?
Yeah.
Right.
If I could just elaborate on some of the points that were already raised, I think, you know, one of the things that, and related to your question, but also on a more macro level as well, that in my experience, and I feel very strongly about this, and I suspect others probably feel similarly, that the key to having an effective, diverse, and inclusive organization is integrating diversity and inclusion into how the business operates and how the culture supports it. And I say that because one of the things that we have been very deliberate about is to bake into the system diversity diversity and inclusion. So we hold people accountable for diverse slates. That's where we originally started, right? Then we thought, okay, this is great. We have a bunch of diverse slates, but are they converting? Now we're holding people accountable for conversion rates and actually looking at that by individual, business unit, and across the organization. And then finally, to build off Jyoti's point as well, in the talent review process. So not setting up a separate review process, but as part of the regular talent review process, let's make sure that we have this focus on diversity and inclusion. And I think by building it into the system that way, you're making a much stronger case for changing the culture. Another thing I'll add to that very specifically is from a leadership development perspective, we've been very deliberate about saying we're not going to have separate leadership development programs to help managers understand diversity. We're going to run an inclusive leadership program. If you're a leader at Thomson Reuters, we expect you to lead and build diverse teams. And to Michael's point, at the end of the day, hold those individuals accountable. So we worked into our performance management system, as I'm sure other companies have done the same, to track the manager's contribution to diversity and inclusion all across the board. And in that model, then, that's the link back to compensation and to advancement. But again, really building it into the system, baking into the system so it doesn't feel like a separate exercise, but it's part of how we operate.
You know, I'm gonna direct this question, and I'm sure that there's others. Can I ask you to hold for just a second? I want to ask this question kind of to build upon what was just asked, and I'm going to actually direct this to both Jyoti and at least to Jyoti to start with first, and if the others you want to chime in, feel free to. Jyoti, I want to ask you about how can, keeping in mind, you know, all these mechanisms that your groups, what you're all responsible for, you know, all the programs, all the different kind of processes, all these things that you have in place. How can your new majority talent advocate and also collaborate with you? So not just being the recipients, but also the partners of being able to create this change.
Yeah, so it's a great question. One of the things we've done is we formed a community of practice, which is sort of corporate-wide, but it's for people who are interested in helping us advance the diversity and inclusion agenda at our company, because they have a passion, they care about it, they're interested, they want to give back, they want to pay it forward, whatever. It's a community of practice that convenes regularly, so we act as the facilitators and the conveners. And that's actually been one of the most powerful mechanisms for us, because we've been able to sort of bring together people from around the company, from all of the lines of business and support areas from various geographies, to come and talk about what some of the issues are and to help us co-create solutions for issues that we want to address around the company. So that's sort of mechanism number one. The second is we have a global diversity and inclusion council and then regional and country-based councils. So it is a decentralized model where we've got activities going on the ground relevant to local markets. So we're not saying here's corporate, here's global, here's what everybody needs to do, but it's rather here are the priorities that we're setting for the company, and for each location and market to help determine and drive where they most need to affect change and address the pain points. So I'd say those are some of the mechanisms. And then the last piece is we have 6 business and employee resource groups. And don't underestimate the power of that grassroots movement. We have thousands and thousands of our employees involved in these groups, and we catalyze them, we mobilize them, and they have been, I think, a big source for us in helping us on the journey.
I would just add to that, we, in addition to our BRGs, over the past couple of years, we launched senior manager forums, one for the Asian community, one for the Hispanic community, one for the Black community, and then also the LGBT community. So those are led by our managing directors, and so they're within the community, right? So deciding and helping think through the strategy. And now we're going to bring everybody from those groups together to really think about how do we work together, how do we share best practices to really think about how we're creating a stronger and more inclusive environment. So it will be, I think, as Deb said yesterday, it's that kind of bond within and that bridge across that we need in order to create the inclusive culture.
Okay, I know that there's a question out here. I want to make sure we get to your question.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Rahul Balirao from DTCC. Thank you for sharing all your best practices. So I know you talked about some of the good initiatives which are either being implemented or already implemented in your respective organizations. But when you look at D&I as a whole, what are the key or top 3 or 5 challenges which you still foresee in forging ahead in next 3 to 5 years?
Great question. So what are the challenges that you see over the next 3 to 5 years is, I think, his question as it pertains to D&I.
I would say that the tone that's being set in Washington, because this tone that's set in government will filter over to the private sector. And in some cases, if the private sector, they feel as though that they don't need to invest in these programs, they won't. And so that's one of the biggest challenges that we face right now.
Okay.
I'd say, just building on Michael's comments, the reskilling and retooling of the labor force to meet the jobs of tomorrow that we don't even know exist today. And the dynamics are changing. I mean, I work in the oldest bank in this country, the Bank of New York Mellon, which was founded by Alexander Hamilton 233 plus years ago. But we are not a bank. We are actually more of a technology company than we are a bank. We have probably about, I'd say, 40% of our workforce in technology or related jobs. We're hiring financial engineers, right? Not bank tellers. So I think that is probably one of the most biggest challenges that we're facing on the diversity front, not knowing what the jobs are going to be, and then the talent pool that you're going to need to fill those jobs.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct, is the talent pool. And I think as the jobs change quickly, I'm actually very worried about the culture, because many people will view kind of any of the shift in power as a zero-sum game, and that fights everything that we're trying to do to create an inclusive environment. And that's how a lot of people are thinking about, like, these, as they're competing for these jobs and they're trying to get reskilled. I think people are going to feel like they're continuing to lose power, and I think that is going to have a big impact. You know, we only have people how many hours a day at work? 8, 10, maybe 12 hours? And then they have the rest of the time outside. So the rest of that time, they're being influenced by a lot of outside forces. And so we have a little bit of time every day, in addition to competing with, you know, all of the other work deliverables on their plate, as we continue to try to build it into the culture. To your point, there's still a lot we're fighting against. And I think we have to be realistic about and deliberate about how we're trying to build that inclusivity into our culture.
Actually, I want to just build on something you just said earlier. You know, you talked about we all have to be ready to be able to tell our story, you know, be ready when that opportunity comes that way. And as I think about head versus heart, right, you know, we could talk about all the business case scenarios and all the reasons why, you know, companies need to do X, Y, or Z, or why anybody needs to do, you know, to be committed to diversity. But at the end of the day, people still, I feel like, you know, they may understand the data, but I don't think people are responding to that. So to your point that you just made about, you know, there's all this time outside, what are they hearing? And what better can we do than to build that narrative, that story where it responds to people in their guts and in their hearts, not just appeals to their head. And so, I mean, there may not be an easy answer to that, but I think it just kind of strikes me that that's something that I wanted to share based on what you just said.
And I think, I just want to respond to that. I think one of the things that we are actually trying to do about that, and our Advancing Black Leader Dialogue started that last year, is really having honest, open conversations. And I think that's how people learn, like that one-on-one experience will start to capture the heart, because then people are really starting to have an honest dialogue. And that means setting the stage so that, you know, when Valerie opens the meeting, it's kind of like, well, why do you say Black and not African American? Like, let's start with the real question on people's minds, and let's say that we are open to have a real discussion, and then people will go away, we hope, and have those conversations then after we've set the example and role modeled it. So I think that's one way to start to capture the hearts at more of a mass level.
And I'm just going to reiterate a couple points that were made and elaborate a bit. Jyoti mentioned the power of the business resource groups, right? I mean, I 100% agree with you. You cannot underestimate the value of the affinity that comes with being part of a business resource group. So there's the business part, as we've been talking about, to Linda's point, but there's also that opportunity to meet with individuals who are facing similar challenges, and then crafting that bridge across the business resource groups as well. The intersectionality factor, we were talking about this behind the scenes earlier, about how we have to look look at diversity more broadly, not necessarily always in individual categories, but let's think more broadly about the intersectionality factor, and that many people fall within a multitude of these different categories, for lack of a better word, and how that impacts the culture ultimately. So I think that's something that's really important to pay attention to. And I would just add that just keeping that balance as well of the head and the heart is really important. And I think this may sound really, really trite, but because it's such an old word, but it actually is the reality for those of us sitting in the room. You know, conscious bias and unconscious bias still exist. You know, we've all been training people on these issues for years and years, but we still have a battle there, getting back to some of the challenges as well. And at the core, in my humble or maybe not so humble opinion, of diversity and inclusion is bias, right? And whether it's conscious or unconscious. And so we have to continuously address that issue in the workplace and more broadly.
Actually, I want to just perhaps raise, and I'm going to just say, if anybody else has any questions, feel free to raise your hand, but I want to just kind of say this, just building upon some of the things I've said. You know, there was a panel earlier or yesterday around millennials, and I work at my organization. We do leadership development, and we work across sectors, we work across different age groups. So one of the age groups that we work with is college students. And I will tell you, working with college students, they bring in a whole different kind of language. And I am finding myself, you know, even though I feel like I want to be sensitive, I want to be open, I'm an advocate, but I find myself walking on eggshells sometimes with them because I don't know if I'm going to use the wrong terminology that's going to, quote unquote, trigger somebody. And this idea of trigger words and other things like that, I just don't really understand. It's a whole different other kind of conversation, even conversations around intersectionality. And so are you finding challenges around that? How can you have a heart-filled, open, honest dialogue if you're not supposed to say certain words because it may trigger somebody? It's like you may, for example, I mean, something that you may say may unconsciously or inadvertently create a reaction in someone that causes distress. So, for example, you know, if unknowingly you're talking to somebody who's a victim of sexual assault and some kind of word is said that just then, you know, kind of triggers a bad reaction. And so there's this kind of different way of speaking that I think we're all supposed to be more conscious of. And
I guess I showed I'm not conscious.
I don't know. Are you experiencing any of this? I don't know. I'm seeing it because of the students that I'm working with, and so I was just curious if this has bubbled up to your workplaces yet.
So obviously I don't know the trigger word as a thing. I'll research it, but I don't know it. But I do think in opening these dialogues that we've wanted to have, we have talked about the fact that we're going to have to accept some risk. So I sit in human resources, so the human resources leader said, we will have to accept some risk that managers and people are going to make mistakes and use words or phrases or say things that are not going to be well received. And there will be some tension as a result of that, and how that escalates or how it fully plays out. But we know that will happen, but we want to assume good intent, and that if we open the dialogue, we'll end up in a better place than if we leave it hidden. So I don't know if that exactly gets to your question, but.
Hey, can I add, do you mind if I just add to that point for Pam? Because we do have this conversation a lot. I think there's a message for people in the room too. So to the extent that someone, to the extent that someone makes that trigger word, the first thing I think you need is the environment where people will, in a non-confrontational way, say, oh, that's awkward. But the other thing that we have to do as people of color is to recognize that people are going to make mistakes and help teach, right? So when we have the conversation around, is it black or is it African American? It's no different than saying, is it Asian or is it Oriental? There's still people who walk around here going Oriental, right? So let's talk about why it's no longer that word and what the real word is. So I think it's a two-way street when it comes to the trigger message. We must create the environment where we're teaching each other and not automatically going on the defensive.
Okay, all right. Any questions that are out there? Because I'm going to start wrapping this up. I'm going to, okay.
Yes, hi, my name is Alain. Last night I was explaining to my 2 teenage boys what I was doing in the city, attending the new majority. So one of my eldest, 16, said, "Oh, great, we're going to take over the wide world." That's, okay, so what is the ultimate goal for you as recruiter in the long-term plan? You say forging ahead, but what's your ultimate goal?
Our ultimate goal in terms of recruitment specifically, or forging ahead more broadly?
Okay, so maybe that kind of gets to the last question that I was going to ask you all anyways, which is, what does success look like to you? And let's finish with that. How about let's have everybody just very quickly just share that. What does success look like to you?
Dollars that's being spent, how many of those dollars were in fact paid to minority and women-owned businesses? Because we understand and know that access to government contracts equals home ownership, better educational opportunities, and better healthcare options. And we can bridge the gap of living in a tale in 2 cities, Fortune 500 capital of the world and the South Bronx, and make it one city.
It's kind of like what Ron Busby was just saying
Right,
about
exactly.
economic empowerment for the communities. Okay.
Right, and secondly, ensuring that our workforce is reflective of the 5,000 miles that we service. Our workforce needs to be reflective of our market.
I would say equality, parity, equal access, where we're not looking at issues around gender lines, racial lines, sexual orientation lines, sort of a dissolving of all of that, and where you have true parity and meritocracy, and it's really about the best talent, the best person, with equal opportunities for all. That, to me, is sort of desired end state.
100% agree. I mean, that was very well said, and that the environment feels so inclusive that everybody feels like they belong.
I would agree with everything that was aforementioned by my esteemed panelist here. I would add two things. Number one, getting back to the story about your son. So I'll tell you this slightly controversial story, but I'll share it briefly.
We promise controversy.
There you
so
go.
That's okay. Yeah,
I'll add
make
some
sure to include
profanity
some
as well.
profanity too.
I'm not so good at that part, but no, I'm kidding. But my 15-year-old son, the other day, we were walking into a building carrying some things, right? And I said, "Nicholas, would you mind opening the door for me?" And he goes, "No, that's sexist." I said, "No, it's not, my friend. That's the difference between good manners and a totally different issue between diversity and good manners. So do not confuse them." And I tell you that story because it's fascinating, the youth of today and the next generation, how they're so well aware of so many things. I mean, I can barely hold a conversation with him sometimes. I'm like, "Who are you? Are you 45 years old?" But on the flip side, there is still this labeling that goes on. And I think building off many of the points mentioned earlier is how much we can move away from that labeling and actually into a more fluid environment and more fluid conversations. I always joke, okay, controversy again, I always joke that I'm the least politically correct diversity officer in the community. And that's because I believe in real conversations. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to be able to say, and Valerie mentioned this as well, what's the reaction to something that's controversial when you're having a discussion one-on-one or in a group setting? So I'd like to see that change. And then I'm gonna come back to my original opening point around the link back to sustainable development in the world and really looking at those 17 sustainable development goals and the linkages between sustainability, community investment, and diversity and inclusion, and how that will open the doors for access for all.
All right, so with that, we are out of time. I want to say thank you to our panel. This was a great conversation to end the day. Hopefully some ideas for all of you about how we can all collectively, as a new majority, forge ahead. So I want to say thank you to all of you for your engagement. Hopefully you'll stay longer, I think, for the reception that will be coming up, and hopefully you'll also be curious enough to ask more questions of the panelists after this is wrapped up. Thank you.